You're hearing the sound of a league in freefall. Not from poor ratings, not from lack of talent, but from something far more dangerous: betrayal from within. For weeks, fans have been talking about the drama, the insults, the viral comments that seemed too wild to be real. But what if those comments weren't the story at all? What if they were just the spark that set off an explosion that's now threatening to rewrite the future of the WNBA itself? Because while the headlines screamed about a commissioner's arrogant quote and a superstar's hurt feelings, something else was happening quietly behind the scenes. Something far more serious. Leaked reports, private group chats, and insider whispers all began pointing to one terrifying conclusion: that this wasn't just a PR nightmare. It was the beginning of a leadership collapse. And here's where things get messy. When Minnesota Lynx star and player union vice president Napheesa Collier went public with that now infamous statement, she didn't just expose a conversation. She exposed the foundation cracks that had been forming for years. Her words didn't create chaos, they revealed it. What she said in that single interview sent shockwaves through locker rooms, front offices, and corporate boardrooms alike. Suddenly, every player, every coach, every sponsor was forced to pick a side. The reaction was instant. Fans flooded social media demanding answers. Analysts tore apart every word, searching for hidden meaning. Some called it brave, others called it reckless. But behind closed doors, league insiders say the fallout was nuclear. Collier's words didn't just embarrass the commissioner. They triggered a chain reaction that's now threatening to topple the very person responsible for leading the league into its biggest growth era yet. Because let's be honest, no one expected this. Not after a season that broke viewership records, sold out arenas, and put women's basketball squarely in the national spotlight. The WNBA was finally winning until its own leadership turned a victory parade into a crisis meeting. And that's where our story begins. Today, we're not here to talk about the soundbite that went viral. We're here to talk about what happened after. The silence, the leaks, the sudden player revolt, and the quiet, deliberate moves that may have already sealed the commissioner's fate. What you're about to see isn't speculation. It's the timeline of how one conversation spiraled into a full-scale mutiny, and why the league's most powerful figure may soon be forced out to save the WNBA from tearing itself apart. Because this isn't just about that quote. It's about how power shifted almost overnight from the boardroom to the locker room. And if you think this story is about one player or one commissioner, you're missing the bigger picture entirely. This is the inside story of how the WNBA reached its breaking point, and how a few words spoken in private may have changed everything. It all started with a single interview, one that was supposed to be routine. End of season, media availability, standard questions about next year. But when Minnesota Lynx star and WNBA PA Vice President Napheesa Collier sat down that afternoon, she wasn't there to play politics. She wasn't there to deliver cliches about teamwork or improvement. She came prepared, and what came out of her mouth that day changed everything. Collier didn't raise her voice. She didn't sound angry. That's what made it hit even harder. Her words were measured, deliberate, like someone who had thought through every syllable before saying it out loud. And in that calm tone, she dropped a bombshell that would send shockwaves through the entire WNBA. According to Collier, during a private conversation with Commissioner Cathy Engelbert, the topic of Caitlin Clark, the league's biggest new superstar, came up. What Engelbert allegedly said next stunned everyone who heard it. Collier claimed that Engelbert dismissed the idea that Clark had elevated the league, saying, "Caitlin should be grateful she makes money off the court because without the WNBA, she'd have nothing." That single line, whether true, misquoted, or misunderstood, detonated across social media like a grenade. Fans couldn't believe it. How could the commissioner, the face of the league, downplay the very player responsible for its historic surge in popularity? But Collier didn't stop there. She went further, saying Engelbert had also remarked that players should be on their knees thanking their lucky stars for the media rights deal I got them. It was the kind of quote that doesn't just sting, it enrages. It painted a picture of leadership drenched in arrogance, completely disconnected from the players driving the league's success. And when you put those words next to Caitlin Clark's record-breaking attendance numbers, her national headlines, and the millions of new fans she brought to the WNBA, the alleged comments sounded less like pride and more like contempt. Within hours, clips of Collier's interview were everywhere. Twitter, TikTok, ESPN segments, YouTube breakdowns. It was spreading like wildfire. But the part that really made it explode? The reaction from inside the league. You see, it's one thing for fans to be outraged. It's another when players start echoing that outrage publicly and fast. Multiple players, including some of the league's biggest names, started posting cryptic messages. Tired of the disrespect. We hear everything. The silence says it all.
By that night, it wasn't just a story. It was an uprising in motion. The league office tried to stay quiet at first, but silence only made things worse. Each hour without a statement felt like another nail in the coffin. The internet was demanding an answer, and the longer the commissioner said nothing, the guiltier she looked. Finally, 2 days later, the WNBA released a statement. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a denial. It simply said that Collier had mischaracterized her conversation with Engelbert. But that phrase, mischaracterized, might have been the single worst word choice imaginable. Because in the age of instant social media analysis, fans know what that means. It's not a denial. It's corporate speak for, we said something close to that, but don't want to admit it. That's when the situation went from bad to catastrophic. Instead of calming the storm, the statement poured gasoline on it. Collier's version now looked even more believable. And for the first time in league history, the players weren't just questioning their leadership, they were uniting against it. What began as one player's bold statement was quickly becoming a full-blown player revolt. But this wasn't the end. It was only the ignition point. The moment the league lost control of its own story. Because while the commissioner's office tried to contain the damage, the players were just getting started. And what happened next didn't just shake confidence in leadership. It threatened to rewrite the power structure of the entire WNBA. Because the real chaos was only beginning. When the WNBA's official statement dropped, it was supposed to calm things down. Instead, it did the exact opposite. Fans read it once, twice, and realized something was missing: accountability. There was no apology, no denial, no humility. Just that one word, mischaracterized. That was all players needed to see. Because when someone says you mischaracterized a conversation, they're not saying you lied. They're saying you told a version of the truth they wished had stayed hidden. And that's when the floodgates opened. It started with whispers, subtle posts, side-eye emojis, players liking tweets that questioned the commissioner's leadership. But within 48 hours, those whispers became megaphones. Sophie Cunningham, Indiana Fever guard and teammate to Caitlin Clark, posted the message that sent shockwaves through the league. She's the most delusional leader our league has ever seen. Those 10 words hit harder than any dunk or buzzer beater. Because Cunningham wasn't an outsider throwing stones. She was inside the locker room, next to the very player at the center of this storm. It wasn't just outrage anymore. It was open rebellion. And she wasn't alone. Across the league, big names started speaking up. Stars with MVP titles, championship rings, and global fan bases. One of the most powerful voices in the sport, Las Vegas Aces legend A'ja Wilson, broke her silence too. Her message wasn't a direct attack, but it didn't have to be. The tone said it all. She stood with Collier. She stood with the players. That was the moment everything changed. Because when A'ja Wilson, a two-time MVP and one of the faces of women's basketball, sides publicly with the opposition, it's not just a disagreement anymore. It's a movement. For decades, the WNBA has battled for legitimacy, attention, and fair pay. But now, for the first time, the players weren't fighting the fans or the media. They were fighting their own commissioner. The rebellion spread fast. Players from rival teams were suddenly united under one banner, not by team colors, but by principle. They were tired of being disrespected, tired of being told they should be grateful instead of powerful. And this time, they weren't afraid to say it out loud. Behind the scenes, insiders describe an atmosphere of panic inside league offices. Calls were being made non-stop, not to sponsors, not to networks, but to crisis PR firms. The goal wasn't to fix the damage, it was to survive the next 24 hours. But the damage was already done. The internet had chosen a side, and it wasn't the commissioners. Clips of Collier's interview were being stitched into TikToks with millions of views. Twitter threads dissected every corporate word in the league's statement. Sports podcasts were calling it the WNBA's first leadership collapse. And while Engelbert's office scrambled to control the narrative, the players had already taken it over. It wasn't just a PR problem anymore. It was a trust problem. The people who made the WNBA worth watching, the ones who filled arenas, sold jerseys, and brought in record-breaking viewership, no longer trusted the person running it.
That kind of break doesn't just heal with a press release. It demands a reckoning. So while fans and analysts were focused on the social media storm, something far more strategic was happening behind the scenes. One player, the league's biggest name, was about to deliver the most devastating blow of all. And she didn't have to shout, tweet, or even post a statement, because Caitlin Clark was about to show everyone how silence can be louder than any word ever spoken. While the rest of the league was engulfed in flames, players venting online, fans dissecting every quote, executives in damage control, one person stayed perfectly still: Caitlin Clark. No tweets, no press statements, no emotional outburst, just silence. And in that silence, the most powerful play of the entire scandal unfolded. Because while everyone else was scrambling for attention, Clark understood something that most people in power never do. Silence can speak louder than outrage. Every hour she stayed quiet, every interview she didn't give, every question she didn't answer built tension like a drumbeat. The league was panicking, but Clark was waiting, watching, letting everyone else reveal their hand. And when she finally did speak, it wasn't explosive. It wasn't even long. It was surgical. During a post-practice interview, a reporter finally asked her directly about the controversy, the alleged comments, the players' revolt, the commissioner's silence. Clark didn't raise her eyebrows or break into a rant. She simply said, "Napheesa made a lot of valid points." That was it. One sentence. Calm, measured, unshakable. But to anyone paying attention, it was the equivalent of a knockout punch, because in that short response, she validated Napheesa Collier's claims, aligned herself with the players, and quietly discredited the commissioner, all without sounding divisive or emotional. It was the media equivalent of a checkmate delivered with a whisper. And just when people thought that was it, Caitlin's camp, not Caitlin herself, confirmed to journalists that the commissioner had never reached out to her following the scandal. That detail changed everything. The story instantly shifted from "what did Engelbert say" to "why hasn't she called?" It wasn't about quotes anymore. It was about leadership, or the lack of it. Because think about that for a second. The commissioner of the league hadn't picked up the phone to speak to the player who single-handedly made that league a mainstream headline. The same player she was accused of disrespecting. The same player whose name had become synonymous with the WNBA's rise. That silence wasn't just neglect, it was proof of disconnection. Proof that Engelbert had no grasp on the emotional pulse of her league. Caitlin didn't need to call for anyone's resignation. She didn't have to demand action. She simply let the commissioner's inaction speak for her. Behind the scenes, players reportedly saw it as a masterclass. She didn't pour gasoline on the fire. She took away the oxygen. While others were shouting into the chaos, Clark simply turned her silence into strategy. Fans noticed too. Comments flooded social media. Caitlin didn't even have to say anything. That silence said it all. You know you've lost when the most famous player doesn't need to call you out publicly. By staying calm, Clark shifted the balance of power without ever touching the chessboard. For years, league leadership held the illusion of control. The idea that players should be grateful for opportunity, that the system built their fame. But this moment shattered that illusion, because if the WNBA had given Clark the platform, Clark had just proven she didn't need the league's permission to lead it. Her silence turned into something bigger than protest. It became a public referendum on the commissioner's credibility. And in that single move, Clark didn't just defend herself, she indirectly positioned herself as the league's moral compass. That was the breaking point. The moment executives realized that Engelbert hadn't just lost the players, she lost the trust of the one person who could define the league's future. And from that moment on, her days as commissioner were numbered. But what came next would move the story from public chaos to private panic, the kind that happens behind closed doors, with lawyers, executives, and whispers of resignation. Because while the internet was still dissecting tweets, the real battle had already shifted to the boardroom.
While the headlines and social media outrage raged on, something far quieter and far more dangerous was happening behind closed doors. Because while the world debated tweets and statements, the real story wasn't unfolding in public. It was unfolding in silence, in boardrooms and private calls, where every word carried weight and every leak was deliberate. Inside the WNBA's Manhattan headquarters, the mood had shifted from damage control to containment. Staffers were ordered to stay off social media. Press requests were being redirected, and even longtime insiders were being left out of calls. Something big was happening, but no one was saying what. Then the first leaks started to appear. At first, they were small, anonymous whispers on Twitter, vague mentions in podcasts from plugged-in journalists. But then came the first credible report. According to multiple sources cited by The Athletic and Front Office Sports, league owners had begun holding informal discussions about Commissioner Cathy Engelbert's future. The language was subtle: concerns about leadership, questions about trust, internal review of options. But anyone familiar with corporate PR knew exactly what that meant. When phrases like review of options start appearing in public, it's already over. But what made these leaks different was where they came from. These weren't player reps or anonymous agents. These were insiders, people with real access to ownership-level conversations. And they weren't speculating. They were preparing the public for what was already in motion. Reports began circulating that several team owners were furious, not just about the alleged comments, but about the response that followed. They felt blindsided by the commissioner's tone-deaf statement, frustrated that what could have been handled privately had now exploded into a full-scale player revolt that threatened the league's biggest off-season ever. One insider put it bluntly: "You can't lead if no one's following." The players stopped following weeks ago. Behind the scenes, it wasn't just about bad PR anymore. It was about business, big business. With record-breaking attendance and unprecedented TV interest, the WNBA was finally positioned for a landmark collective bargaining agreement. Billions were potentially at stake in future media deals, sponsorships, and expansion plans. And yet here they were, trapped in a scandal that made their leadership look unstable. The timing couldn't have been worse. Multiple sources confirmed that the owners group had quietly begun seeking crisis transition advisors, corporate consultants who specialize in managing leadership changes without triggering panic in the market. In other words, the league was preparing for a replacement. And that's when the leaks intensified. Each day, a new report added fuel. Confidence in leadership is deteriorating. Several owners have privately expressed frustration. Change at the top is no longer off the table. None of these leaks came from random sources. They were coordinated. Someone inside the WNBA's ownership circle was controlling the narrative, feeding just enough information to the media to soften the blow for what was coming next. Because here's the truth about high-level sports politics. When leaks start flowing, it's not chaos, it's choreography. Every anonymous quote, every report suggests, every insider claims, it's all part of the same quiet campaign, a campaign to make the inevitable seem reasonable, to prepare fans, sponsors, and even players for a leadership change they've already decided behind the scenes. And while this was playing out in the press, inside the WNBA office, the walls were closing in. Executives began avoiding meetings with Engelbert. Senior staff whispered about non-disclosure memos and exit options. People could feel it. The tide was turning.
By this point, every conversation inside the league had shifted from if Engelbert would be removed to when and how. It was no longer about protecting her image, it was about protecting the league's future. And that's when the most telling detail emerged. A leaked memo reportedly circulated among team executives, outlining potential leadership transition scenarios. It didn't mention Engelbert by name. It didn't need to. Everyone knew exactly who it was about. The plan was simple: manage the optics, keep the league stable, and move forward before the CBA deadline arrived. Because the league's biggest problem wasn't just a PR crisis, it was a ticking clock. Every day the commissioner stayed in power was another day the players dug in their heels, and another step closer to total breakdown during the most critical negotiation in league history. The owners could feel it, the sponsors could feel it, even the players could feel it. The walls were closing in, and inside those walls, the quiet decision had already been made. The WNBA wasn't waiting for fan outrage to fade. It was waiting for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. And when that moment came, it wouldn't be announced with a press conference. It would arrive in a carefully worded statement about new leadership opportunities and fresh direction for the league's future. Because that's how power changes hands in sports. Not with fireworks, with silence, strategy, and one final signature. But if you really want to understand why that decision happened so fast, you have to look at one thing: the money. Because as the league was imploding in public, the financial clock was quietly ticking in the background, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. When the public sees a scandal like this, they see headlines, outrage, maybe a few trending hashtags. But inside the league office, none of that is what truly keeps executives up at night. It's not the PR firestorm, it's the balance sheet, the contracts, the deadlines written in black ink that can't be postponed no matter how chaotic things get. And that's exactly where the WNBA found itself. The timing of this controversy couldn't have been worse. The league wasn't just entering the offseason, it was entering the negotiation of its lifetime, the new Collective Bargaining Agreement, or CBA. That single document would determine everything: player salaries, revenue sharing, travel standards, endorsement rules, even how much control players had over their likeness and media exposure. And the current deal? It was set to expire on October 31st. The clock was ticking. Under normal circumstances, a CBA renewal would be tense but manageable. But this time, the WNBA was dealing with a perfect storm. Thanks to Caitlin Clark and the surge of new attention around the league, revenue projections had skyrocketed. Ticket sales were up, merch was selling out, TV ratings had shattered records, and social media engagement was at an all-time high. For the first time ever, players weren't walking in those negotiations asking for fairness. They were walking in demanding a piece of the explosion they built. They wanted upgraded charter travel. They wanted a bigger revenue share. They wanted a system that treated them as partners, not employees. And here's the twist. Under any other commissioner, those negotiations would have been historic, the crowning moment of a new era. But under Engelbert, They had become impossible. How could you send a commissioner into a negotiation room with players who had just publicly accused her of disrespect, arrogance, and dishonesty? How could you expect trust when the vice president of the Players Union, Napheesa Collier herself, had openly declared war on leadership? You couldn't. Every owner knew it. Every insider could see it. There was no path forward with Engelbert still in charge. The league didn't just have a credibility crisis, it had a business crisis. Because if those negotiations fell apart, the consequences would be catastrophic. A strike was on the table. A lockout was a real possibility. And the idea of losing an entire season, right when the WNBA had finally captured mainstream momentum, was unthinkable. We're talking about sponsorship deals worth tens of millions of dollars, TV contracts up for renewal, expansion franchises in the pipeline, the kind of growth that women's basketball had waited decades for, all suddenly hanging by a thread because of one leader's misstep and one disastrous response.
So behind the scenes, the decision started to look less like punishment and more like survival. The league had two choices. One, keep Engelbert, risk a full-scale player strike and jeopardize every new deal on the table. Or two, make a leadership change now, show the players they were being heard, and salvage the CBA negotiations before it was too late. There was never really a choice. Multiple insiders told reporters that the ownership group began referring to Engelbert's removal as a strategic reset. Not a firing, a reset. The kind of language that sounds calm on paper but screams panic behind closed doors. Because they knew the truth. The WNBA couldn't afford to enter those negotiations with a leader who had lost the locker room. The players held all the leverage now. They knew it, the fans knew it, and even the sponsors could see it. For the first time in league history, the players weren't the ones who needed the league. The league needed them. And that was the fatal shift Engelbert never saw coming. The CBA deadline wasn't just a date, it was a countdown to her exit. Every day that passed without resolution, the pressure mounted. By mid-October, sources claimed ownership had reached what one insider called a quiet consensus. The commissioner's leadership was officially deemed unsustainable. And when those words appear in an internal memo, the conversation isn't about if someone's leaving. It's about how soon you can make it happen without spooking the investors. Engelbert had become a liability, not because she was bad at her job, but because she was bad for business. And business, not outrage, is what always seals a person's fate at this level. So when the time came to make the move, the league didn't hesitate. They knew that removing the commissioner before CBA negotiations wasn't just symbolic. It was the only way to show players that the WNBA's leadership was serious about change. It was the most ruthless, pragmatic decision imaginable. A sacrifice made in full view of the world. And in that sacrifice, something larger happened. The balance of power permanently shifted. The players were no longer just athletes. They were shareholders in the league's destiny. And with the money and the deadline aligning like a doomsday clock, the owners finally realized what fans and players had known for months. There was no WNBA future unless they rebuilt trust from the ground up. By firing the commissioner, they weren't just ending an era, they were trying to save one. But that's not where the story ends. Because even after Engelbert's fate was sealed, one question still haunted every meeting, every press room, and every locker room. What happens next? Who steps into that power vacuum, and can the league survive the fallout? That's where this story takes its final turn, from collapse to rebirth. When the smoke finally started to clear, something felt different. It wasn't just about the commissioner anymore. It wasn't about one interview or one comment. What had happened inside the WNBA over those few volatile weeks was bigger, deeper.
It was the quiet realization that power had officially changed hands. For decades, the narrative had always been the same. The league leads, the players follow. Executives make the rules, athletes play the game. But the last few months shattered that order completely. Because this time, it wasn't a coach or an owner or a media leak that brought the system to its knees. It was the players. One statement from Napheesa Collier, calm, measured, but unflinchingly honest, cracked open the illusion that the WNBA's leadership was untouchable. Her words weren't an outburst. They were a mirror, a reflection of what players had been feeling for years but didn't dare say out loud, that leadership wasn't listening, that gratitude was being demanded instead of earned. And when players across teams, cities, and rivalries began standing together, not as competitors, but as a unified front, the league had no choice but to listen. That's the real story here. Not the scandal, not the quotes, not even the firing. The story is that the WNBA, a league long dismissed as struggling for recognition, just experienced something monumental, a player-driven revolution. Because here's what makes this moment historic. For the first time in modern sports, it wasn't the fans or the sponsors or even the media that forced leadership to change. It was the athletes themselves. The people who are the product decided they would no longer be treated like a product. That's not rebellion, that's evolution. And Caitlin Clark, whether she intended to or not, became the symbol of that shift. Not because she shouted the loudest, but because her silence showed where the real power now lived. When she refused to play the league's PR game, when she didn't rush to defend or attack, when she simply existed outside their control, she proved something everyone in sports media had quietly suspected. The WNBA doesn't define Caitlin Clark. Caitlin Clark defines the WNBA. And that's the kind of influence no commissioner can contain. It was the same for A'ja Wilson, for Collier, for Cunningham, all of them stepping into a new kind of leadership, one that wasn't assigned, but earned. The old playbook of top-down control, where executives dictated culture and players followed the script, had officially been thrown out. Now, the players are the culture. They control the narrative. They drive the numbers. They command the sponsors, the fan engagement, the conversation. Every highlight, every soundbite, every viral clip is theirs to create and own. And once that balance shifts, it never shifts back. The WNBA isn't the same league it was 6 months ago. The power dynamic has permanently flipped. Behind the scenes, owners know it, sponsors know it. The next commissioner, whoever steps into that seat, will have to know it too. Because the era of be grateful to play is gone. The era of we built this together has begun. It's a transformation that mirrors what's happening across all sports. Athletes reclaiming agency, using platforms, and refusing to be silent when leadership fails them. But in the WNBA, it hits different. Because here, that power shift wasn't theoretical. It was public, raw, and irreversible. The players didn't just change the conversation, they became it. And the irony? The very thing that nearly broke the league, disrespect, arrogance, and silence, became the catalyst that forced it to evolve. It's poetic in a way. The commissioner's mistake became the player's moment. A moment that declared, loud and clear, this generation of WNBA stars isn't waiting for validation. They're taking ownership of their image, their influence, and their league. So yes, the headlines say Cathy Engelbert out, but history will remember it differently. It will remember this as the day the balance of power in women's basketball changed forever. Because when Napheesa Collier spoke, she didn't just call out a comment, she called out a system. When A'ja Wilson stood up, she didn't just show solidarity, she showed leadership. And when Caitlin Clark stayed silent, she didn't just avoid controversy, she demonstrated control. 3 different moves, one united message. We're not just playing the game anymore, we own it. The league will rebuild. It will find new leadership. It will sign new deals. It will expand to new cities. But from this point forward, one thing is certain.
The WNBA will never belong to its executives again. It belongs to the players now. In the weeks following the uproar, a strange calm settled over the WNBA. Not peace exactly, but silence. The kind that comes after a storm, when everyone's too exhausted to keep shouting. But make no mistake, this wasn't the sound of resolution. It was the sound of reconstruction. Behind the scenes, the league began its quiet reset. Meetings were reshuffled, press events postponed, emails carefully worded. Publicly, it was business as usual. Preseason planning, sponsorship coordination, media appearances. But privately, everyone knew the truth. The WNBA had reached a crossroads. Because the firing of a commissioner doesn't fix a system, it exposes it. And now the question haunting every corner of the league wasn't what happened, it was what comes next. The search for new leadership had already begun. Insiders reported that owners were divided between two schools of thought. Some wanted a stabilizer, a seasoned executive from the corporate world, someone who could reassure sponsors and investors. Others wanted a reformer, someone who understood the culture, the players, and the social momentum that had made the WNBA more relevant than ever. Two visions, one league. Meanwhile, the players, the very group that had brought this transformation to life, weren't waiting around to see what the league would do next. The WNBA PA was mobilizing fast, strategizing ahead of the looming CBA deadline. Their tone had changed. No more polite bargaining, no more deferring to authority. They were coming to the table not as employees, but as equals. And their message was crystal clear. You can replace a commissioner, you can't replace the people who built the movement.
That single idea, ownership of narrative, is now the heartbeat of the league. Sponsors have noticed, networks have noticed, and even critics who once doubted the WNBA's ability to command headlines are watching with curiosity. Because this isn't just about basketball anymore. It's about influence, perception, and the evolution of women's sports as a cultural force. For years, the WNBA fought to prove it mattered. Now, it's fighting to prove it can manage its own success. The Caitlin Clark effect, once seen as a marketing miracle, has turned into a mirror, reflecting everything the league both celebrates and struggles with. Her rise forced the WNBA to evolve faster than it was ready to. It forced executives to confront the gap between representation and respect. And the irony? That uncomfortable growth might be the best thing that ever happened to it. Because for the first time, the league has everyone's attention. Fans, sponsors, media, and maybe, finally, the full respect of the sports world. But that attention is fragile. And the people rebuilding the WNBA know it. The next few months will decide everything. The new commissioner will have to walk into a negotiation room filled with players who know their worth, players who have already proven they can topple leadership with nothing more than truth, unity, and silence. That's the new reality. The WNBA isn't a hierarchy anymore. It's an ecosystem. And ecosystems don't run on authority. They run on balance. So as the league moves into this next chapter, one thing is clear. This wasn't just the fall of Cathy Engelbert. It was the end of an era where executives ruled by fear and the beginning of one ruled by collaboration. That's what makes this moment historic. Because if the WNBA can rebuild itself the right way, if it can channel this chaos into a system where players have real power and leadership earns real trust, it won't just survive, it'll thrive. But if it doesn't, if the next commissioner repeats the same mistakes, ignores the same warning signs, and forgets that this new generation of athletes doesn't stay silent, the league won't implode again. It'll simply evolve without them. That's the beauty and the danger of what's been created here. The WNBA's future no longer belongs to one office or one name. It belongs to the people who made it matter in the first place. The athletes, the fans, and the voices who refuse to be ignored. So now the question isn't whether the league can recover, it's whether it can keep up. And that's where the story leaves us, at the edge of something new. A league reborn through controversy, rebuilt through conflict, and redefined by its own players. What happens next will decide not just the future of women's basketball, but the future of athlete power in all of sports. Because once you give players a voice, you can't take it back. The truth is, what we just witnessed wasn't just a controversy, it was a power shift in real time. And whether you love it, hate it, or still don't fully understand it, one thing is undeniable. The WNBA will never go back to the way it was. Because this wasn't a headline that came and went. This was a statement. One that said, "We see you, we hear you, and we're not backing down." Cathy Engelbert's downfall might have started with a single quote, but it ended as a referendum on power, respect, and what leadership means in a modern sports era driven by visibility, social media, and player control. The old model, where commissioners dictated narratives and players quietly played along, is gone. What comes next is uncertain, messy, and unpredictable. But it's real, and for the first time in a long time, it feels like the league finally belongs to the people who built it. So now the real question isn't what happened, it's what's coming. 1. Will the WNBA's next commissioner learn from this and rebuild trust? Or will the same system that created this collapse repeat itself under a new name? And most importantly, can this league turn all that chaos into something historic? Because make no mistake, this isn't the end of the story. It's the start of a new chapter. The era of quiet players is over. The age of accountability has begun. And if the last few months have proven anything, it's this. You can ignore the noise, you can deny the headlines, but you can't silence momentum. So, what's your take? Was Engelbert's removal a necessary reset, or a desperate move from an organization losing control? And who do you think should step up to lead the WNBA into this new era? Drop your thoughts below. Seriously, the best part of this story isn't what's already happened, it's what happens next. If you made it this far, you're not just watching, you're part of the conversation. So hit that like button if you believe in holding power accountable. Subscribe if you want the real stories behind the headlines, and make sure notifications are on. Because this story isn't over. It's just beginning.